Support comes from St. Louis Public Library Foundation, helping the library serve children and their families with programs and services needed to become lifelong readers. More information about the foundation is at slpl.org.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. In 1980, Lâm Flamenco was 24 years old. That year, like thousands of others trying to survive in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, she boarded a boat, leaving her birthplace to find a new home. It was a dangerous journey to her eventual destination. Tragically, it was a journey her husband did not survive. Hoang eventually settled in St. Louis, a place that has welcomed refugees and immigrants from many different parts of the world. In the decades since her arrival, Hoang has made her mark here, especially if you like Vietnamese food. More than 30 years ago, Hoang Lam opened a restaurant, Truc Lam. The restaurant and the journey its owner took to get here are the focus of a story in the latest issue of Sauce magazine. And here to talk about it and Truc Lam is that story's author, food writer Ileana Martinez. Ileana, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Elaine.
So for anyone who routinely drives on Gravois Avenue in South City, Truc Lam's green awning is probably familiar, and it's certainly a welcome sight for you, Ileana, because I understand you were already a fan of the restaurant before you were assigned to write about it for Sauce. What is it that drew you to Truc Lam?
Truc Lam was actually one of the first restaurants that I ate out at when I was new to St. Louis, because I've loved Vietnamese food for years. I first moved to St. Louis from Houston, which has a massive Vietnamese diaspora population, and it's packed with great Vietnamese restaurants. So Truc Lam was in the neighborhood, and it stood out to me as something that would scratch the itch for pho while I was new to the city. And so I've been a regular for years, and when the opportunity presented itself to write a landmark piece, I mean, that was when I first learned how old Truc Lam was in the first place. It's over 30 years old, so I jumped at the opportunity.
Was it a surprise to learn that it has that long a history, especially, being in the restaurant?
It was surprising because, the pandemic, for example, was hard for a lot of well-established restaurants. And so to be open for that long and have survived that was a feat in and of itself. So it's impressive that, a single person has been able to helm the restaurant for that long.
Mm-hmm. So with any dining experience, it's not just about what is going into your mouth, but what you see around you. And you write, Truc Lam is more than a collection of objects inside. It's a living, breathing entity shaped by the life of the woman who created it. So talk with us about that, Ileana, and the ways that the restaurant really reflects Hoang's story.
Right. Truc Lam is, if you look around the restaurant, it's a collection of different things that she either has brought back with her from her visits to her homeland, or even gifts from regulars who adore her. So that's one thing that I didn't talk as much about in the piece because it would have turned into a description of all of the objects in the space. But there's a couple of paintings that she brought back from a trip in the 90s. There are one of the things that made me laugh in the interview is that she has a lot of paintings of flowers, like still life flower portraits. And she said, I don't really like flowers, actually, but these are all gifts from my customers, so I have to put them up.
Okay. Do you have a regular seat in the restaurant?
I migrate around depending on how many people I'm with.
Okay. So yesterday, St. Louis on the Air producer Danny Wysentowski stopped by the restaurant, and he talked with Hoang in the kitchen. She talked about what the store has meant for her and for her family.
Because I sponsor my father and my family come here, and I need to have something for their work. And we make a restaurant. My mother helped me cooking, something like that.
So, Ileana, you had a chance to talk with Hoang. What is it that you learned about what it took to keep this restaurant running now for more than 30 years?
Aside from the fact that it took a very hardworking person who went in and day out, almost every single day for the past 30 plus years. She also had a lot of support from her family. She has many siblings, and her starting the restaurant allowed her to slowly migrate them over to the U.S. through family sponsorship. And she's just brought in siblings over the years. Some helped her in the early years before they left St. Louis to move to other cities in the U.S. She has family all over the states now, some in Florida, some in other states, but she wasn't able to keep all of the siblings around for very long because these days she only has one sibling who helps her out along with her son.
And she identifies her by that relative by number, right? Calls him number 10.
Yeah, that was an interesting part of the interview where I just saw them kind of counting off on their fingers. Okay, this sibling was here for this long, and then that sibling was there before they moved, and now we're at number 10.
Now, we have talked a little bit about the story behind the restaurant, but let's talk about the food there. So Huang said that her pho is a big hit with customers. Remind us of the basics of what pho is, and then what it is about Huang's pho at Truc Lam that is distinct from maybe other Vietnamese restaurants around town.
Yes, you can't go wrong with the pho there. They have a really long menu, but can't go wrong with the pho. And at its core, it is a massive serving of some sort of bone broth or meat broth that's cooked over the course of many hours to really extract the flavors of the meat. It has rice noodles and slivered types of meat that go in raw. Oftentimes the most popular variety are beef brisket, but you can add all sorts of different things like meatballs, seafood, chicken, even tofu if you're vegetarian. And it's always accompanied with a side of a heaping pile of fresh herbs like basil, mint, cilantro, bean sprouts, just to freshen it all up because there's a lot of umami meatiness in the broth. Did I miss anything? I always add lime to offset it. But yeah, it's the pho.
And it's a dish that you have to eat. If you have glasses, you got to take them off because it gets steamed up, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And
so you also write that one of the only things that has changed at Truc Lam is the menu, and that the menu has gotten shorter. So it used to be over 300 items and is now, quote, only 100 today. So what are some of the other dishes on the menu that put a growl in your belly and a smile on your face?
Sometimes it all depends on the day or the time of year, but one thing that I consistently enjoy is their beef banh mi. The beef is stewed in a way that it still kind of has a lot of meat juices when it goes into the French bread, into the baguette. And so it kind of moistens the baguette. And that's something that I get almost every time is just a side appetizer. Spring rolls are something you can't go wrong with. But then there are other items that maybe the average person going to a Vietnamese restaurant hasn't heard of before that kind of allows you to explore more of the regional cuisine of southern Vietnam. So a lot of dishes based in seafood, right? Like seafood noodle soups or fish cooked in a clay pot or seafood porridge are other kind of alternatives to the tried and true pho and banh mi.
And is there anything that you learned about how Huang has approached making some of these dishes in order maybe to make them more approachable to non-Vietnamese customers?
That was something that I was curious about and asked her in the interview, was the extent to which she had to tailor recipes to the American palate. And her response was that for the most part, she's stayed true to the recipes she's learned from her parents. And the only modifications she made, like you mentioned, was to abridge the menu for some of the items that weren't selling as frequently, just to kind of simplify the menu.
Right.
But otherwise, they've kind of tasted the same for all those 30 years.
Yeah. Now, another thing that you note in the piece you've written is that in the restaurant's early days, Nearly all its customers were from St. Louis's Vietnamese community, and that has certainly grown over time. And today it's a place where locals walk in off the street. You talked about seeing it when you first got here to St. Louis. And these connections, between a restaurant, its owner, its customers, and the community around it, it came up when Hoang spoke with our producer, Danny Wysentowski. And she talked about seeing generations of customers and having them come back to the restaurant years later.
After that, they come about 15, 20 years, and I don't recognize them, but they know it. They know. You don't remember me before I come here. I had about 5 years, 4 years, like that. They remember me. Yeah, that's right. I love it. Yeah, I love it when I see them.
You can really hear her personality sort of in how she speaks.
I love her.
So, Ileana, what is it that you learned from Hoang about how her restaurant has changed over the years, and specifically how it is that Truc Lam became, as you write, a fixture in the Tower Grove South neighborhood?
Yeah, Truc Lam has really ingrained itself in the South Grand area. Like she said, people kind of fall in love with her when they first meet her, and despite language barriers, just her warmth and energy and joy and ability to welcome people in is what has kept regulars coming back. And so, and also, of course, the delicious pho, right, has been, for a lot of people who didn't grow up eating Vietnamese food, a way to welcome people into the food and the culture. Mm-hmm. And so I'm also just kind of where Truc Lam is positioned within St. Louis City, right? The surrounding neighborhoods have changed over time, just as the Vietnamese community has changed over time. And so I think that's really reflected in the customer base.
Mm-hmm. Now, this Sauce Magazine piece that you have written about Truc Lam is part of a series, and that series is called St. Louis Landmarks, and it highlights restaurants that have been in business for 30 years. It seems like we're living through a time when it's hard for a restaurant to make it even 3 years, let alone 3 decades. And you mentioned the pandemic and the toll that it took on so many places. What is it that you felt and sort of absorbed as you were talking with Hoang about what it takes to keep a restaurant going for so long? And perhaps even in the time that you have spent in the restaurant, or even driving by and seeing people who are going in, what is it that you make of that? Like, how do you keep a place going for as long as 30 plus years?
Yeah, that's where the phrase "it takes a village" really makes sense, right? It took family coming together, all pitching in where they could before life took them in another direction, having the support of her son and still having one sibling to help out and give her one day off a week. Mm-hmm. It just takes kind of a small community. And also one thing that I asked about with the pandemic in particular and how they were able to survive that was that it helped that she owned the restaurant and they were able to kind of survive those years. Mm-hmm. And it's just a testament to how much work she put into being able to call the place her own and not lose it during that time.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Ileana Martinez, who's a food writer at Sauce Magazine, and we're talking about the South St. Louis Vietnamese restaurant Truc Lam and how it is part of a series now about St. Louis landmarks and these restaurants that have been around for such a long time. And on that note about landmarks, I think it's kind of a funny thing in that once a place reaches that status of landmark, it almost like contracts in that, on the one hand, the place is so recognized as part of a city's or neighborhood's identity, but at the same time, it is so easy to take for granted that it's there. So that familiar green awning, which is the case in Truc Lam, that it just becomes kind of part of the background. Is that something that Hoang maybe alluded to in some of her responses to you about why she has kept this business going for so for so long and maybe not branched out to something else?
That's an interesting question. We didn't talk as much about kind of that side of being a restaurant that survived for that long. We did talk a little bit about kind of foot traffic these days and how there are some days or some times of day that are, frankly less busy than others. And it's just interesting talking to people who have only recently happened upon Truc Lam and are talking about it to their friends, like, have you checked out this place on South Grand? But for many, it's been a part of their entire lives. So it's really like two sides to the story there. And I think she would have had a lot to say about that if we had talked more about it.
And before we came in to talk on the air, I asked about your relationship with pho and with Vietnamese food. You told me about the restaurant where you first had pho. It was very far from here. Tell us about what that first experience was and why you were seeking something similar when St. Louis became your new home.
Yes, I first tried pho as a high school senior in South Florida, where I grew up, at a restaurant in Miami called Pho 79. And I had never heard of pho before that day, just wasn't a part of my upbringing, but I went with some friends and it truly changed my life. It's not an exaggeration to say, just given how aromatic it was. I hadn't ever had broth before that had those particular spices like star anise, cardamom, more like warming spices that don't exist in the food of Central America, which I was more familiar with. But it became a quick favorite. I carry that love of pho with me through college in Houston, where there is a much higher density of Vietnamese restaurants. And then that was what made Truc Lam immediately stand out to me when I was new to St. Louis.
So last question here. Now that you've been able to write about this restaurant that has kind of a special place in your own heart, introducing it to people who have not been familiar with the restaurant, or having it be a place where transplants like you can find a little piece of what they remember from home, how does that feel?
How does it feel to introduce it to your friends? Oh, I mean, part of me just wishes that people have known about it all along. But now that I've had the chance to write about it, I just want to kind of introduce not just the restaurant, but the story to everybody that I care about. Now I feel invested in the restaurant and the family in making sure that more of my friends have a chance to try just how good the pho is there, and just kind of maybe help it go from 30 years to 40 years if that's what the family wants. So.
Ileana Martinez is a food writer working in St. Louis. You can read her latest piece in Sauce Magazine's September issue, and we'll have a link to that piece on our website as well. Ileana, thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Elaine.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
and Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.